The age of exploration was between two countries, Spain and China. And here in the West, we don't really talk about the Chinese age of exploration under the Ming Dynasty. Now, both China and Spain were looking for cheaper trade routes to India because it is capitalism which drives the world, the desire for profit, for entrepreneurship, etc., etc. So these two governments were looking for cheaper trade access to India, and they were going to sail their respective oceans. So the adventures of Zhonghe are very important to exploration and advancements in navigation, but they are not as important as the Spaniards discovering the New World, what that opened up for trade, for materials, etc., etc., far surpasses that of Zhonghe. The main killer of the natives was smallpox. And now I'm not very well versed in virology or anything of that nature, but to my understanding, pox is a virus which develops in the bowels of farm animals. And the natives did not have domesticated farm animals like the old world did. Um, so, had the Chinese gotten to the New World, those natives still would have died off because they were not immune to pox. And what we colloquially refer to as Spanish is actually not Spanish, it's Native American. So, for example, like Spanish people, or if you're going out for Spanish food, that's actually not Spanish, right? Things like corn tortillas, that's Native American food. So if you go out for tacos and burritos, etc., etc., that is not Spanish food. That's Native American food. True Spanish people are from Spain. Now, Spain was originally a colony of Rome. It was the first Roman colony outside of Italy. Um, and the Spanish word for Spain is España, which is cognitive to the Latin word Hispania. Now, we typically think of Native Americans as being red people with feathers in their hair and tribal paints, but really, a Native American can be anyone who is native to America, which is a very broad spectrum of tribes and peoples. Now, these people still exist. The political narrative that Europeans came over and wiped out all the Native Americans isn't exactly true. So, for instance, if we look at the Aztecs, the ruling class of the Aztecs were known as Mexica, and that's where the word Mexico comes from. So, obviously, Mexicans are still around. While they had many marvelous cities, Tenochtitlan, which is present day Mexico City, Teotihuacan, Tikal, Chichen Itza, Cusco, Machu Picchu, etc., etc. It's very interesting to note that the Native Americans never left the Stone Age. They never developed metalworking or bronze or iron, etc., etc. They never domesticated animals, as I said previously. So when the Spaniards crossed the ocean to come to America, in a way they traveled through time. Just like if we were to go visit Sentinel Island right now, as far as technology goes, the advancement is huge, and it's essentially traveling back in time. So they went from the Stone Age through the Bronze Age, through the Iron Age, into the Gunpowder Age, and into the early Industrial Age. That's like 5,000 years of history, and they went through that in a century and a half, 2 centuries. So their society, on top of the deaths from the pox, um, wars with the Spanish, for real. And just to play devil's advocate, in fairness to the Spaniards, if I was on a boat for 6 months and I landed in some strange place and I saw a bunch of Mexicans tripping balls on peyote and ripping people's hearts out to make corn grow, yeah, diversity would not really be on my mind either. So I don't really blame them too much for going to war with the Aztecs. And I would also like to point out that while the Spanish conquest of the Incas was pretty brutal, the Mayans were already sort of gone through their own wars and through sort of climate disasters in that area. Some tribes did side with Cortez against the Aztecs, but I'm not a citizen of Nicaragua. So, what about the history of the natives in the United States? Now, contrary to the liberal establishment, what we learned, the natives were not just one like monolithic group. It wasn't just white people against all of the Indians. Um, their relationship to the federal government varies depending on what tribe you're looking at. Some tribes sided with the federal government. Some tribes went to war with the government. Some tribes sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War. But the biggest historical lesson that we can learn from the European arrival is that you do not have open borders and free food welfare programs for illegal immigrants who are not assimilating into your country, right? Um, we all know the story of the Pilgrims on Plymouth Rock and the Indians that helped them on Thanksgiving, giving them food, and they all had a big dinner. Did any of those white people go out and do the rain dance to make that corn grow? No. So then why are the tribes responsible for giving them welfare and all? And look what happened. Look what happened. You have open borders. You bring in these illegal immigrants. What happens? Your country's gone because they did not assimilate to your tribe. And there's one thing I want to touch on. A lot of people will say that the Vikings discovered the Americas before the Spaniards. It is true that Leif Eriksson made it to northern Canada and down into Maine, and Maine is a part of the United States, so this is relevant. That is in a book called The Ecclesiastical History of Hamburg Bremen by Adam of Bremen. So this is pretty historically accurate. There's archaeological evidence. I just want to point out that Leif Erikson was not a Viking. All right, Leif Erikson was a Catholic. Okay, to be a Viking, you have to believe in Odin. All right, Leif Erikson did not. His father, Eric the Red, did. And that might not be a big deal to anybody out there, but to me, I just want to set the record straight on what a Viking is. You cannot be a Catholic and still be a Viking just because you're Danish or Icelandic. That's not how it works. Events such as the landing of Plymouth Rock, you have Bacon's Rebellion, and the French and Indian War. These all happened prior to the ratification of the Constitution, which was in 1787. So that would not count, in my opinion, that would not count towards the history of the United States. It counts towards history in general, the history of the Americas, but the United States begins in 1787 when the Constitution is signed and ratified in Philadelphia. Now, with regards to educational curriculum, I think that each state should teach the history of the tribes of their state. But I also believe that every state should teach like the major points of Indian relations with respect to the federal government. So obviously, let's begin with the first president, George Washington. George Washington did allow the tribes to sort of do their own thing, practice their own customs, etc., so long as they paid their taxes and they respected the Constitution. They were treated like any other group within the republic. But that's not to say that there weren't skirmishes a little later on, particularly around the time of the War of 1812, which is a war we don't really talk about too much. While we did go to war with Britain, we also went to war with Native Americans. We fought the Shawnee Confederacy under the control of Tecumseh. War of 1812, there were two future presidents who were generals. William Henry Harrison, who was a Whig president, and then Andrew Jackson, who was a Democrat president in the South. Most famously, he led the United States to victory at the Battle of New Orleans. Tecumseh was a very good leader, very charismatic, and William Henry Harrison would actually say of him that had he not been born so close to the United States, he actually would have made a great emperor. But Tecumseh and the Shawnee Confederacy were defeated, and so that Northwest Territory was enveloped into the federal government and became the states that we know today: Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, etc. Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, would fight in the South against the British at New Orleans, as I said, but he also fought in various Indian wars. In particular, he fought in 3 Seminole Wars. The Seminoles were one of the 5 civilized tribes of the South. They were particularly in northern Florida. That's why the football team is named the Seminoles. When Andrew Jackson would become president later on, there was a big ruckus to get the Indians out of the South. And so what happened was the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed. When it was passed, it was actually overruled by the Supreme Court because I don't know how many people know this, but forced death marches are actually unconstitutional. Not many people know that. But when the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, Andrew Jackson famously stated, "Mr. Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." And so he overruled this. He got rounded up his own militia, and in despite of what the Supreme Court ruled, he forced them to march from Georgia all the way to Oklahoma. But it is an interesting fact that the tribes that were in the South, as I said, were allowed to practice their ways under George Washington. Some of them actually assimilated, but one thing they did do because they were in the Democrat South was that they had slaves. So when Andrew Jackson forced them to march from, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, that area to Oklahoma, they actually took their black slaves. Fast forward to 1919 during the Tulsa race riot, that's why there were black people in Tulsa, Oklahoma to begin with, because they were actually taken there as slaves by their Native American masters. Now, a little bit after the presidency of Andrew Jackson, you get another Democrat, James K. Polk, who's a very underrated president. He would be the president that would instigate the Mexican-American War. So he would annex Texas. And Texas wanted a little bit more, what is now West Texas. They wanted their border to stretch out to the Rio Grande. So what James K. Polk did was he stationed troops along the Texas border to sort of like provoke the Mexicans, and he made an offer to buy certain territory from the Mexicans, which was a very lowballed number, and Mexicans felt very disrespected. So now this is the only time that the border of the United States has ever crossed the Rio Grande. It was during the Mexican-American War when the American Union troops occupied all of Mexico. As America was occupying Mexico, the Mexican government signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave a lot of territory to the United States. So this brings us up to the Civil War. Now, during the Civil War, some tribes sided with the Union, some tribes sided with the Confederate South. After the Civil War, most of our presidents from this time are going to be Republicans. This would begin the Great Sioux War under the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. Gold was discovered in the Dakotas. Dakota is also a tribe. And so when we discovered gold, we went right for their land, and this would begin the Great Sioux War against the Plain Indians, the Cheyennes, the Lakota. These would see people like Sitting Bull. You also have, under the presidency of Grant, the Comanche campaign. Now, the Comanches sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War, and they also made use of the horse, which was a type of technology that was brought over by Spaniards. Then, of course, there's little sporadic wars here and there, things like the Black River War. You would have wars up in Washington against the Spokane, the Red Clouds War in Montana. There's a lot of little wars with the federal government to acquire territory. In 1887, Democratic President Grover Cleveland signed into law what's known as the Dawes Act. And what the Dawes Act did was it gave the president the authority to divide Native. A little later on, in the late 1800s, under Republican President William McKinley, we would go to war with Spain. The USS Maine had a malfunction in its engine, or whatever ships use, and there was an explosion. And through fake news, it was told to the American public that this was an attack from Cuba, which was occupied by Spain at the time. It was still a Spanish colony. But we defeated Spain, And so we acquired a lot of territory um, from their empire, such as Panama, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and then, of course, the Philippines over in Asia. Now, the only territory that America still holds is Puerto Rico, which is a protectorate or a commonwealth or one. It's not a state, but we still own that territory. Cuba would be liberated during the Communist Revolution. The Panama Canal, which was eventually built, was given back to the Panamanians during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. In 1924, Republican President Calvin Coolidge signed into law the Indian Citizen Act, which gave citizenship to all Native Americans. He would also be the president to authorize the construction of Mount Rushmore. Now, I don't know much about the history of Native Americans in World War II, but I do know that the Navajo used their language as a code to help Allied soldiers communicate without being detected by the Axis powers. Ronald Reagan in 1986 signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which is something that I agree with, that if you hire an illegal immigrant for a job, you should be punished because you're the one breaking the law by not hiring a citizen and paying them, what we would consider a legal wage. But there's been attempts to solve this issue, obviously, in the 21st century. So one attempt was a Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act, or the DREAM Act, which never passed Congress. So it was never passed into law. But it would give citizenship to the children and the minors who were here illegally. And then, of course, under Obama, you have the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. Now, this is a bullshit law that's unconstitutional because it never passed Congress. It was an executive order, which are not constitutional. That's not how the president is supposed to do things. The president is not a king who can just do things through edict. They have to get things passed through Congress. And DACA was never passed through any sort of legislation. Second of all, it doesn't do anything. It's a deferred action. Okay, to defer means you're putting it off. And then we get into the modern day issue. And one thing that really annoys me is the canceling of the Washington Redskins. What makes me mad isn't that people think Redskin is offensive or anything like that. So you have the Redskins, right? But then you also have the Cowboys, who were the ones who killed the Native Americans. And for some reason, they don't have to change their name. And that's just because Jerry Jones has more power and influence than Daniel Snyder. Cowboys. Now, another one would be the Sooners, the Oklahoma City College team. What is a Sooner? Well, I mentioned the Dawes Act, right? When that land was divided up. When Oklahoma was being divided up, there were a bunch of settlers who were first in line to claim that land, and because they arrived soon, they were called Sooners. So the people who killed the Indians, the Cowboys, and the people who took Indian territory, the Sooners, that's fine for a sports team, but the Washington Redskins, they have to be the Commanders now. All right, so in conclusion, the point of this video is to show that Native Americans were not killed off. Native Americans are still here. And when you look at the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, and unfortunately the god-awful French, these four countries are former colonies of the Roman Empire. So when they came to the New World, when they conquered the Native Americans, they brought with them the glory of Rome. And that is why we call them Latinas and Hispanics. When you see videos or pictures of some dude up in the Andes Mountains with some llamas, that is not a Spanish person. That is a Native American. That is an Inca. And then, of course, while Republicans are not blameless in wars and crimes against the Native Americans, I still feel that, again, they are way better than the Democrats. Hopefully you learned something. Maybe you saw something from a different perspective. And hopefully you can go on to see Spanish people as Native Americans.